So today we're going to talk about position versus time graphs. Most importantly, what can we find from a position versus time graph? The first thing that we're going to talk about is position. As you can see on a position versus time graph, the y value tells you position values and the x values tell you time. So each coordinate point tells us the position and the time. In this order, though, time first and then position. The next piece that we can find from position versus time graph is velocity. The slope is what tells us the velocity, because velocity is a change in position over a change in time, or a change in y over a change in x. Again, position, time. The last bit we can talk about is acceleration. And that would be telling us, the curve tells us the acceleration. Curve being a change in slope. And the change in slope is going to tell us the change in velocity, and the change in velocity over time is our change in acceleration. So, let's look at a specific example. When we look at this position versus time graph, we see that each point tells us a position and a time. So this point right here is 15, 4. So 4, 15. So at 4 seconds, the object is at position 15. Now we talk about the slope. We can interpret this graph and say, well, right here we see a positive slope. So we know at this point we have a positive velocity. At this point, this time interval, we see we have a negative velocity. And right here, the slope doesn't change. The slope is 0, and the position doesn't change. So we have 0 velocity. We look at each individual leg. From here to here, the slope doesn't change. And if the slope doesn't change, that means acceleration must be 0. Well, that's true for every one of these points. We don't see a changing slope anywhere here. So if there's no changing slope, the acceleration is 0 all the time. Now, let's take a look at a little bit more complicated example when it comes to figuring out what the velocity and acceleration might be. Okay, so when we look at this position versus time graph, we notice that the lines aren't straight. We see a very distinct curve as we go around, looking much like a parabola. So, again, the points still tell us a position and a time. So right here, it looks as though we're talking about at 4 seconds, the position is 9. At 0 seconds, the position is 3. And at 10 seconds, the position is 0. So nothing changes there. But we do notice it's tougher to distinguish what the slope is at any given point. So we can't really identify the exact value of the velocity at any point, but we can say things about whether or not it's positive or negative. So looking at the velocity here, we see that we have a positive velocity. And over here we have a negative velocity. So we know at some point we went from positive velocity moving forward to a negative velocity coming back. Up here we see the velocity is 0. So we can talk about the velocity and the direction that we're going, as well as the magnitude, whether we start high or we end low, or we start fast and we end slow. But let's talk about the acceleration now. So we notice that this is a curving graph. So we start with some velocity. Well, if we were accelerating, that means we'd be speeding up. And if we're speeding up, then the velocity would increase. We start with a positive velocity here, and as we see this tangent line here, the velocity is not as steep as it was before. It gets less steep, and then even less steep here at the top where it's almost 0. So we know from 0 seconds to about 4 seconds, we're slowing down. And at 4 seconds, we stop. Well, what happens after that? Well, we go from a 0, and well, now we have a negative velocity. So 0 to a negative velocity, well, we're increasing the speed more and more, and it seems to kind of even out here, so it seems constant at the end. But we start from 0 and we increase to a negative velocity, so we're speeding up, but it's in the negative direction. So if you were to describe the acceleration or the motion of this object, you'd say we start at 3 at a somewhat constant velocity. We begin to slow down until we get to 4, where we stop, change direction, and begin speeding back up in the negative direction as we go on. And that's pretty much everything that we need to talk about when it comes to what we can figure out from a position versus time graph.